Welcome to the Configure It Done podcast. The Configure It Done podcast is a place where successful thought leaders in the SAP space come to share their leadership styles, their tips, and their unique stories on how to run successful large-scale SAP programs. Listen to the podcast to learn from their successes, their failures, their career stories, and their inspirations.
This podcast is in partnership with the Black Dog Institute, who aim to create a mentally healthier world for everyone. If you wish to support the cause, please donate via the link below.
Now, thank you, Sehida, for joining us today. Absolute pleasure. Today we've got my Managing Director, Simon Hare, with us as well. Over to you, Simon.
Yeah, Sehida, the big question I've got for you is a little bit different to how we normally ask questions on this podcast and the normal structure. If I take us back to April 2020, what we were doing as a business, we were obviously very nervous about the pandemic, and we were reaching out to our clients and saying, what's going on? Like, how does this affect things? We were really, really worried, hence the lines I've been left with. And it was the one day I was working from home. I remember you kindly give us an hour of your time, and I asked you this question. I said, how are SAP Australia, and how do you yourself see this kind of panning out over the next couple of years? And you answered that question. I think it was about a 35 minute response, and you answered it so well. And what's amazing is when I look back at what you answered, everything has happened. You talked about the pent-up demand, that you were worried about, the immigration and the lack of resources in this country, and you talked about, the S4HANA side of things and that pent-up demand, and you talked about how SAP were going to focus on the health and well-being of your resources, which you've done amazingly well, by the way. So you've obviously got a crystal ball. So the question for you now is, how do you see the next year or two panning out? Obviously, we're still in a bit of a weird situation, but how do you see it panning out? And I promise what you say we won't take for gospel, but yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you for reminding me about what I said in that last conversation. Look, a lot of that has played out. I think for me, right now, health and wellbeing is still a core part of this. How do we continue to operate? And whilst there's this huge positive in, our change in approach with ourselves and our customers in remote working, bringing the best talent to bear, not necessarily who could fly to that particular location. I think we're still evolving and learning how to operate that way. I think many of us are still working. How do you control the demand and set up that personal time as well as work time? So we're still, for me, health and wellbeing is still a key part of that, and continuing to monitor that, even though we think we're doing great things in flexible work arrangements and all the rest of it. There's still more to be done there. I think in going forward, that pent-up demand, and honestly the border thing, is reality. And I've the pleasure, or for me, the pleasure of living in Canberra and get to hear a little bit about what's going on when it comes to opening up our borders. And I think it'll be a little while before we do, and hopefully when we do, that we do focus around skills and bringing skills back into this country, because no matter where, and particularly actually in IT, we feel it very strongly, skills are always a challenge, and we can absolutely focus on growing the talent in Australia, which, I know at SAP we're talking about that ourselves. So what else do we do? Certainly encouraging our ecosystem to do that. But even if we all focused on that, and the entire ecosystem focused on developing the current talent and the next generation of talent, we're still not going to have enough talent in this country. So for me, I'm hoping to see that the first openings of the borders will be skills related. And I think from some of the forums I've been to recently around the budget, there's a true economic connect to that, and bringing skills into Australia. So Australia is thriving on skilled migration to this country. So for me, that's got to be something that we watch and has to pan out. I think if it doesn't pan out, we will continue to struggle. I think there are some interesting things going on in Australia as legislation is being looked at, and not only Australia but around the world, around what all countries consider critical infrastructure in those countries. And there's a piece of legislation that's being drafted and considered around critical infrastructure for Australia. And I know we're not unique. I know Canada, the UK, other parts of the world are all looking at this. And I know we, as SAP, as is much of the market, is looking at what that will play out. What does that mean for Australia? Yeah. So for us, there are certain investments as SAP that we're making. And certainly you would have heard Damien Buno speak about that recently at an AFR conference with government around our critical data cloud. So, so what are we doing to help support that initiative within Australia? And I think it's certainly something I look back at last year, COVID was horrendous, but for a lot of organisations in Australia, cybersecurity was horrendous and being hacked was horrendous. So that for me has brought into light that need to truly understand not only the functions and features of what we do in software, but the security around what we do as we move to cloud. So I certainly think that will be something that each industry segment, each customer will need to assess its needs about how secure do they need to be and what measures do they need to take in that. And obviously customers have choices in that. And that's part of the journey, but also for us in the SAP space, as we support our customers, knowing your functions and features isn't the only thing that you'll need to know. You'll need to understand the upstream and downstream implications around creating, a secure environment for your customers and what they do with that data. Other things, that pent-up demand still continues. Certainly, I think there's an ongoing interest around where do organisations continue to take themselves, and we see organisations that have doubled down. There's certainly a lot of demand out there. I speak to our partners. Our partners are busy. We're busy. Our customers are busy. Not all customers are on the journey yet, but I think many of them are finding that they need to get on the journey. Mm-hmm. But I think they're also considering critical business value to them. And I think previously it'll be interesting to see our skills transform. And I think that whole piece of, dear customer, what would you like? Yes, we can either configure that or build that. Honestly, particularly the build that piece will diminish because customers are sitting there and thinking about what is critical to them to be unique and what should just be common. So, unique is competitive advantage. Unique is compliance. We do it because, a standard product doesn't meet that, but for those reasons, and everything else can almost be mainstream, and there are certain processes and a lot of processes that organisations run that are, governed by the same accounting standards or other compliance standards, and that should be mainstream stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's not where you invest. That's where you want that turnaround quickly, not where you want to invest your big dollars. And I think more organisations will think far more critically about what's their unique competitive advantage or what's their compliance challenge that they have to deal with, and that's where they'll hone their effort. Yeah. And the rest, honestly, we see the market going to cloud. We see the market going to common standards, which is a lot of what cloud enables. So those are some of the things that I see, skills. I see the opening up of borders first for skills. I think for many of us, like myself, who'd love to travel around the world, sadly, I don't think I'm going to get to do that for a little while. But I think we'll see some investment in skill internally. I think we'll also see ourselves challenged. A lot of those in the SAP space doing the same thing will not be good enough. Yeah, okay. That pitch to your customer as to why they should do it a certain where the uniqueness comes in, to be able to articulate that, not just I can turn it on for you, but actually be able to provide some of that advice to their customers will hold them in very good stead.
Right. I knew you were going to give us an amazing response to Heather, so thank you for that. I've got another question for you. When I speak to employees, and I include contractors in that, of SAP Australia, about how you've tackled the last 12 months or so, the word that keeps coming up is humanistic, is business. And I saw a real shift and change in SAP Australia and the culture in the last year or so. And I've got two questions in one. Where did that come from? Was it coming from Germany, or was it led kind of here in Asia Pacific? And secondly, how have you changed with your outlook as a leader in the last 12 months or so? I know Jay and I, when we talk about this ourselves, we've completely transformed the way we look at leadership and our kind of methodology, but how has it changed your outlook?
Okay. Where's it come from? Certainly in SAP, I think it's come globally as well as locally. I think it's come from both directions. I don't think the guidance, certainly there's been guidance globally, the enacting of it and making it real has absolutely come locally, and to what extent people have taken it has been more of a local initiative. But I think we've also been enabled as leaders locally because of some of those decisions globally that we've made. Those decisions that we made that we would take a certain attitude to our staff, and globally we were determined, no matter how any market was faring, that we wouldn't have forced attrition. We would actually be holding the SAP team together. In fact, we'd be looking at, the pent-up demand, what would come next, because that would eventually come. That had to be led globally. The organisation actually had that view, which I think for us locally allowed us to build on that and make it humanistic. I think, when you work in almost a safer environment, or what is perceived as when everybody's concerned about what's going on in the market, if you've got some of that assurance coming down, it certainly gives you the ability as a leader to make it more humanistic. What have I changed? God, I spent an awful lot of time on a screen, which I never thought I would do. I have, and my team knows this, I'm the one who always turns on my camera. So where previously, God, I would have done it sometimes, but for me, the camera has become the human element to this. So it doesn't matter who I'm talking to, where they are, it's become the default. And in fact, I was only having a conversation the other day, because I'm finding people are reverting back to their old norm of, treating Teams like an audio device, not a visual and audio device, of now saying to people, actually, keep your cameras on, because this is where, how do we retain that connect?
Mm-hmm.
But I think even where before we would deem more social functions or the 2-day get together as the thing that held us together, I've got to reflect on last year and some of the forums that that I facilitated, created, that now have become the weekly 1-hour call, and what we cover off on that. I have a weekly call now with 40-something service leaders in ANZ out of SAP. Previously, we would have been lucky to get together once a quarter.
Yeah.
I've got to say that 1 hour a week now, far more valuable in being connected, aligned with strategy, issues in the business, than what we ever were getting together in person once a quarter.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's a huge learning of what initially sounded like something that was, oh my God, I'm just filling up my diary with all these meetings. But how do I drive the value out of that? To me is incredible. The ones that have stayed the course and really have become the constant. That's invaluable. To me, of the learning.
It's that communication side of things. You're probably across more and aware of more than you ever were.
We assume because we met face to face, we were communicating. I think in a forum like this, when we are, utilising the technology to bring us together to drive thought, drive participation, we actually drive more thought and more participation, because we actually do it in a far more structured way than we would often do when we were just getting together as a group. So for me, that's interesting.
Sure. Okay. I've got a question, Sehida. I saw recently, just on the wellbeing side, I saw recently that SAP had a mental health day, and you give your staff a day off. I had a number of questions from candidates in the market that are outside and not working for SAP, and how that was received from customers.
Surprisingly positive. I've got to say, it was a great initiative, and it was a lot of discussion amongst all of us of how could we really honour that and make that happen for everybody in the team. And literally, out of the services team, every exception had, I asked to be told where we couldn't make it happen. And there were a couple of circumstances because of what was going on in a couple of customers. But actually, our customers turned around and said, what a great thing to do. And so I think that everybody's felt the same way about the last, 12 months. When we were doing that, it was also just as the situation in India was also getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we also work with not only ourselves, but a lot of organisations and our partners who have offshore teams, and for many of them in India. And I think whilst in Australia, and I know it's different now with Melbourne, back in lockdown, but I think we almost got to we were living a bit more of a normal life when we had this day in the India situation, and now Melbourne has made us realise that this thing hasn't gone away.
Mm-hmm.
But really positively received. I honestly did not have anybody saying, "What are you doing, SAP?" We were all actively working with our customers to see how we could make it work, and in fact, many of them doing like, "Geez, I wish we could do that."
Yeah. Well, it seemed to light up LinkedIn, all of your employees. I think there was
one.
one.
Oh, they loved it, didn't they?
Yeah, there was one guy who did a bike ride and he posted his Strava times and stuff and distance on there, and he cycled more than what I drive in a week, I think. It was just crazy in a morning. I don't know who it was. But
There are a lot of people in SAP much fitter than me, I have to tell you.
yeah, high performance, huh? Do you want to continue, Jay?
Yeah, I'd love to focus on your career, Sehida, and obviously you've got to this point, but if you had to look back through your career, who would you say has been your biggest influence, had the biggest influence on your career? And just to the second part of that question, what would they have taught you?
Okay. So maybe if I touch on a couple of people, because I don't, for most people, I don't think it's one person. I think there's part of the journey. For me, certainly in childhood, so I grew up in a country town in North Queensland, and certainly most of our community were immigrant families. So I'm first generation Australian. So for me, I remember him well. Mr. Kelly, Year 5 teacher, who absolutely resonated with me that maybe I should have confidence in my ability and I could do more, and encourage that. So that was for me a bit of a, you grew up in a country town, and honestly, my aspiration was one, to not stay in that country town. That was not, the farming life was just way too hard. It was not where I wanted to be. But also people talk about, you role model what you see and you aspire to what you see. And certainly, what did I see? I saw a lot of people who had immigrated out to Australia with, both my parents had Year 2 education. They came from poor villages in Europe where education was a luxury, not a given. So for me, him, but also then my grandfather, so my mum's dad, who my parents had sponsored to come out to Australia, who moved out to Australia in his 50s. Fairly conservative community. My family background is Muslim, and certainly sending your daughters away to go to school, and I grew up an hour and a half from Cairns. So to go to year 11 and 12, I had to not be home. To go to university, not be home, which was really quite unheard of, to send your children, let alone your daughters, away to do that. And it was my grandfather, because my parents had separated by then, who said to my mother, she's sensible, she's got ability, why would you not encourage her to go to university and support her through that? So basically she would have a life of choices, because my mother found herself, her mum worked on the farm on her own, didn't have an awful lot of choices. So my granddad, looking beyond what might have been the normal. In my work life, lots of little bits from different people who encouraged me along the way. One of the first jobs I had in my early 20s, and I'll share this as a young female, and I ran one of my first public sector jobs. So early in my career, I spent a couple of years in the public sector, worked in the audit office, and I ran an audit for a customer. It was the first audit I'd run, and had my executive director, fantastic gentleman by the name of David McKean, and we were presenting the results. And I'd actually discovered things that were not particularly good in this audit that we had to report back to the executive of the customer who I'd done the audit for. And I remember distinctly turning up to this audit, and David, was in his, I'd say, late 40s at the time, and most of everybody else in the room were gentlemen. They would have all been in their 40s and 50s, and here was me in my then mid-20s, presenting the results and findings. And of course, we got asked, who was going to take, lead the meeting and take us through things, and they looked at David. And David said, "No, I'm not. Sehida's going to take you through this." And for me, one, it was, and I remember having this conversation with David later, it was the perception, because I was the young female, that maybe I wasn't the person with authority in the room, given who I was with, but also someone clearly like David, who absolutely emphasised that I had the knowledge, the skill, the capability, and, both in the coaching before this meeting, coaching after this meeting, that I had the skill and capability. So I think of many people in my career like David, but then, fast forward from there, 10 years later, someone else, the CEO I worked with, Mark Elder, and I remember Mark saying to me, and I ran at the time the consulting team at Plout, across our business in Australia and New Zealand, and Mark saying to me, "Sehida, you've achieved great things." And I spent a lot of my career not talking about my past, where I'd come from, etc., because I didn't come from the right school and the right university and all the connections that some of us you hear about people getting jobs because of where they came from and the connections they had, and I didn't have any of that, so you don't talk about your past. So I remember Mark saying to me, "Actually, you're more like everybody else than what you think you are, and you should be talking about your background. You actually, what helped you get to where you are. Consider the impact you could have by talking about your journey and thinking about that." And that was probably the first time in my career where it was the other way around, rather than what could people do to help me, what could I do to help other people in their career.
Yeah, it's showing that vulnerability and that humanistic side, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then they relate to that. Yeah, that's amazing. Good story.
That's a great story, Sehida. Thanks for sharing that. It sounds like you've had a lot of kind of influences through your career, and a lot of people that have believed in you and give you that confidence to show your best hand, basically. And what I'd love to know, if you were talking to your 21-year-old self, what would you say? What would you say to that younger Sehida that was in that room full of 40-year-old males? What would you say to yourself?
Actually, what would I say to myself? And I have this conversation. My eldest daughter is 20, and sometimes I do it's okay to be indignant with me that this goes on in the world, but maybe tone it down a little bit. And there were times where I was lucky. I had great leaders that I worked with, and sometimes I'd come back and I'd be indignant about what had gone on. And it was, maybe digesting that a little bit more, and it probably took me till my 30s of what impact could I have on that. So the sharing piece, I wish I'd started that journey earlier. For me as well, and I reflect on my career, when you think about your leadership or your management style, earlier in my career, it's funny, you get known for getting stuff done, which means sometimes you're actually quite autocratic sometimes, depending on the situation and pressure situation. I wish I wasn't as autocratic as I was, because I've probably learnt that balance of enabling others is just as powerful in growing your leadership style as it is in getting stuff done.
Okay. And Sehida, a question we asked Justin Langer last week, and it was a good response, so I'll throw it at you as well. Is there a book that you've read on leadership that's had a massive influence in your life? Is there a podcast that you listen to regularly that helps you, or a blog or something? Is there any influences from reading material that you could recommend, or listening material?
The most common, the one that's resonated with me most recently is a book called Uncommon Service. So that for me, when I think of particularly now running a large team, how do I, because I think early on in our career, we get fixated by the superheroes, the individuals that do great things.
Yeah.
And as a leader, in fact, it's great that I've got a superhero, but I actually need a whole team of people that do stuff exceptionally well.
Yeah.
So for me, uncommon service really resonated with me. Others, honestly, various books. So, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, things like that. So it'll be things that I pick up over time of people that I admire out there and read about them.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Justin Langer talked about an amazing book called Boys in the Board about the US rowing team in the 1935 Olympics, I think it was. And I've read that book as well. It is amazing.
Okay.
But that's got that
Taking a note.
Yeah. I haven't heard of that one, Uncommon Service. I'll look that one up.
I'd love to. Normally, Sehida, we've had Nick Zafiris on the podcast. We've had Alex Aitken. They've been very much like delivery focused. They've been very senior positions, and I normally ask them about how they would define success, or what does a successful program. I'm going to slightly alter that question for yourself and just ask you. It's quite a broad question, but what does success look like for you?
Okay, and absolutely, if I think of Alex and Richard, who I know quite well, for me, originally when I looked at projects and things like that early on in my career, it would have been, the functions and features you delivered, it was on time, it was on budget, and that's what you focused on. Now, when I think of success, it's the value that you bring to an organisation. So what's the transformation or the change that you've brought to them that has made them more competitive, more capable than when they started the journey? For me, the other part is how you do that journey, how you go on that journey with them, is as important, because, and I'm fortunate now. I have the privilege at SAP where the skill for me is a given. I assume that everybody in my team has that skill. That is part of the journey that we go on. It's almost a stake at the table. So it's not that you have the capability now. It's how you take organisations on the journey that I measure the success of people. And honestly, the people in our team, and when they ask me, why aren't I getting promoted, or what do I need to do to get promoted? It's as much about, the technical knowledge or functional knowledge they have is the table stakes. It's the skills that they develop to take their customers on the journey with them. And, there are skills that you can develop that, gets that trust of a customer, that has you telling that story with the customer, painting that vision with the customer so they can realise that value. That is, the things that I really look out for. So those are the leaders in my teams. Those are the people that I look for to lead engagements.
On storytelling, Sehida, you're an amazing storyteller, and that is a skill, that is a craft. Do you how have you learnt that, and is that something you teach at SAP as well? Because I know some of your other colleagues that work alongside you are very good storytellers as well, or is that something you look for in people when you're interviewing them? I think it's an underrated skill that is going to become more and more in demand.
I certainly look for it in people, and when we interview, the questions are framed, certainly for me, the questions are framed in share with me your experience or your story in doing this. Because I don't want the theory. I can get the theory from anybody. I want someone to tell me, how they can demonstrate that skill. So, which is really storytelling. Do we teach it at SAP? Yes, we do. Probably not enough. We're getting better. So for those that are, I would say, at the sales focused part of the business, we've certainly gotten much better, that we now think that is mainstream and that we're continuing. There's a whole program going on around that. I smile when you say I'm good at it, because I still think I'm on the journey. And I did some recent training. We had all of the services market unit leaders around the globe of SAP, and there are 34 of us. And we did some great training with a gentleman by the name of Colin James, who's done multiple of these. And part of it is communication, but in his communication teaching, it is the art of using story to bring your message to life.
Yeah.
So, I would still call myself as on the journey, Simon.
Yeah.
not a master of this at all.
You're a very good storyteller. And I'm going to go back to, obviously, we're in this strange world at the moment, and the population's in decline, I understand, for the first time since the First World War. Before COVID, we were making a lot of noise about getting more women into tech.
Yep.
Now we just want people in tech. But is there anything in particular SAP are doing around driving, getting more people into SAP and getting more of those graduates, and in particular women?
Certainly, a couple of things. I think we are reevaluating our connections to the universities.
Yeah.
About how do we influence. But I think for a lot of us, and the Young ICT Explorers, which is something that we sponsor, that we continue to, because in fact it probably even starts before university.
Yeah.
How do you inspire people? My story of you aspire to be what you tend to see. Yeah. If you don't see it, it's very hard to aspire to it. So Young ICT Explorers, certainly, I think we're reevaluating our role with the universities. Some very interesting things going on with TAFEs in universities, so I'm hoping to see that change. I think even various states have gone out to market with approaches, and certainly SAP is talking to a number of them. I'm hoping that in this country that we do a little bit more of what Singapore and Korea have done, where the government has actually sponsored initiatives around this, around certain skills, and certainly in those two countries, SAP is part of that, been part of that. So, but unfortunately, I think some of those things take a little bit longer than I'd like them to, but we're on the journey. Within SAP ourselves, certainly myself, and I have last year had a new regional leader, Liho. We are seriously evaluating what we would do by way of expanding. We already have an internship program at SAP. For us in ANZ, that was more sales-centric than it was services-centric, and I'm pleased to say that will amp up from a services perspective come next year, but not only next year, but for the next 3 to 5 years. So both in internships at SAP, but also more formal graduate programs at SAP. So we're sort of in the midst of locking that in and defining that.
Yeah.
Of structuring that, because for me, it was 3 or 4 years ago within services that we truly ran a bit of a graduate program.
Yeah.
And we're back to, we'll be kicking that off again.
Yeah, I'd love to tap into your leadership methodology. What is it, Sehida, and can you define it?
This is a challenge, and I think it depends on what situation I'm in, Jake, because there are multiple. I'd hope. And it's funny. My husband sometimes says to me, "Oh my God, I wish you could slow down," because I am the glass is half full, and I'm always forward looking. I don't dwell on the past. It's about what can we do next. So I think to my leadership, there's the transformational aspect. It's always looking for something, and I find the new, the different, exciting, and pulling teams together around that. So I think there's definitely a transformational aspect to that. In that, I think there's also a collaborative aspect and a coaching aspect. I hate to admit it, but sometimes there's also, I think, and I think when there's time pressure, or when the situation, I deem as a critical situation, sometimes I refer more to that authoritative, where it's just, let's get the job done. I can't wait for you to make decisions. And that's probably one that I'm working on because, and particularly as you become, when you're a first line leader, sort of acceptable to a certain degree. When you're the leader of leaders, not so acceptable.
I'd be lying, Seed, if I hadn't said that I'd heard that about you.
There you go. And honestly, it's that in the early part of your career, being decisive, being directive, you're a superstar, and then you get to a certain point in leadership. Well, that's not what you bring anymore. That's not what you need to bring to the table. So for me, those would probably be the 4 elements that I'd call out. But I'd have to call out the authoritative. Sometimes it is getting better at the be patient. It'll happen all in good time and soon enough, Sehida, and balancing that. But I think those would be the aspects. And I know there are many other aspects to leadership, but those would be the ones that I'd call out.
Yeah, good answer. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, unless you had any other questions, Simon.
I think that's amazing, Sehida. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time there. I knew this would be amazing.